Bismillah Rahman Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, dear students. This session focuses on speech communities and communicative competence. I hope by the end of this session you would be able to understand the significance of these terms and their interrelationship. Well, my dear students, society impinges on language in various ways. In fact, the very existence of a particular language or the very existence of languages critically and crucially depends on the availability of a kind of a social group that claims it to be their own language, that tries to maintain it, and that always tries to kind of differentiate it from other varieties of language. Such a group can be called a speech community. And the conventions that for the use of language this group believes in is called communicative competence. Now, this is a very important point. You need to understand the difference. A speech community is a group of people based on whatsoever kind of division, but a group of people who owns a particular kind of or variety of language. On the other hand, the communicative competence is the shared set of, conventions that this group believes in when it comes to the use of that language. So this is what we call communicative competence. Well, the notions of speech community and communicative competence are fundamental to the understanding of ways in which social groups organize their linguistic repertoires. A speech community may not necessarily be coextensive with a large language community, because a language community shares a language, whereas when it comes to a speech community, there can be a member in that language community who thinks in terms of the ethnic identity or social identity, belongs to some other group, and thus shares, the speech with that speech community. So a speech community is a group of people who do not necessarily share the same language, but share a set of norms. This is important. They share a set of norms, they share a set of rules about that language, they share a set of beliefs about that language, which makes them a speech community. The boundaries between speech communities are essentially social rather than linguistic, because language at the end of the day is used within the context of the society. Terms such as language, dialect, etc., from a linguistic point of view, then become very non-technical notions when it comes to defining speech community and when we relate it to the idea of speech competence. Actually, there is no objective way of looking at all that when we would call some dialect a dialect or when we would call it a language. Different attempts have been made, but so far, the distinction is still what we would call it blurred. Any attempt to count distinct languages will be an artifact of classificatory procedures rather than a reflection of the communicative practices of the society members or the speakers of that particular language. For example, in Papua New Guinea, people pay very great attention to small linguistic differences in differentiating themselves from their neighbors. There are small villages, there are sometimes less than 500 speakers of a language, and their identity is very closely related to their language. So using language as an identity marker or a dialect as an identity marker, they always try to differentiate themselves from their neighbors, and they always take pride in that as well. So, people in one village or clan insist that they speak a language that is different from the language of the other village, the village that is just next to them. Successful conversation, in the same way, I would say, for many English speakers involves filling any gaps in the talk. Now, this is about the communicative competence. There are certain speech communities where, people would have certain norms and would behave in certain ways. For example, in English-speaking community, when two people are conversing, when there would be gaps in the conversation, when there would be, kind of silences in that, they would try to fill it up with something. Silence, in other words, is regarded as awkward in the English context, but this is not true in all English-speaking communities. For example, I would give you an example of Belfast. A neighbor may visit another and sit in her kitchen silently for an hour or more. Just imagine, how the norms of language use differ, how communicative competence differs. Likewise, in some Aboriginal communities, people may sit silently for hours with an occasional comment. But there are other communities, as I've given the example of English community, where people would try to fill in the gaps that have silence, because silence is not considered to be very appropriate. Well, though most of the Aboriginal people in Australia have shifted from their ancestral languages to English, they carry over in English they speak rules of communicative competence of their Aboriginal languages. This is an important point. As a speech community, what you have learned, what you have grown up with, as the norms and beliefs about language use and communicative competence, when you shift from one language to the other, you carry them mostly, as it has happened in the case of these Aboriginal Australian tribes. The mistake other English speakers make in such situations is to feel that they have to make remarks to keep the conversation going on. So whereas, if these Aboriginal Australian people, if some of them who are still using, now using English, if they would talk to some English speaker, they would prefer to be silent and keep long pauses of silence, whereas the English speaker in that situation would think this is a mistake and they would not like to do that. Talking about the weather in a stereotype situation is often associated with British, not with the Americans, for example. So, my dear students, I hope you understand that each speech community has its own norms of speech competence.